Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Marquette University Law School, the virtual Lubar Center. I'm Mike Gousha, and this is On the Issues. Today, we're talking with the administrator of the Wisconsin Elections Commission, Meagan Wolfe. The Elections Commission administers and enforces Wisconsin election law. And as we all know, it's come under fire in recent weeks from Republican lawmakers who say they were not happy with the way the 2020 election cycle was handled. In fact, some lawmakers have even called on Ms. Wolfe to resign. She has said she has no intention of doing that, and she has defended the work that the commission has done. Meagan Wolfe was named interim administrator of the WEC in March of 2018, and then she was unanimously confirmed by the state Senate in May of 2019. Meagan Wolfe, good to have you with us again, and I guess let's begin there. Does May of 2019 and unanimous confirmation by the state Senate seem like a very long time ago?
It does feel like a lifetime ago. Yes, I will say that. But I think almost everything prior to 2020 feels like it was a different lifetime in many ways.
That's very true. Let me begin with, I guess it is the elephant in the room, and that is sort of the current relationship between the commission and Republicans in the state legislature. Are you disappointed about where things are? Are you saddened by it? Are you angry about it? Because people have questioned your competence, your integrity. How do you feel about it?
I think that a lot of what is said sometimes is either baseless for partisan purposes, or it really represents a complete misunderstanding of how the commission functions, what my role is as part of the commission. And so, I have too much work to do really to stop and be angry about things. And really where I go with this is, what more do we need to do to educate folks about how the commission works, about how elections are administered in our great state? And I think there's a lot to be done there to ensure that people really understand how elections work in Wisconsin, because we have a really unique election system, both at the state level and at the local level. And I think a lot of what's happening right now is either blatant is either partisan and sort of for baseless sort of attacks, and the rest of it is just a misunderstanding of how elections actually work here in Wisconsin.
Let me just ask you, though, does this, no one really prepares for a moment quite like this one, I'm sure. When you took the job, I think most people would not envision necessarily where we are today as being part of that job. How has that experience affected you professionally, personally? Has it affected you?
It is always difficult when you're questioned or your integrity is questioned, but I know that I have the facts behind me, and I know that we've done incredible work. And so I think in a lot of ways, because it is not specific, because some of the attacks have been so baseless, it's not as if there's an actual specific thing that's been done or action that's been taken in relation to me that's under attack. And so I stand behind the great work that I know that I did, that I know my team did, that I know our local election officials did. And I know that if people really understood what our role was in these things, they would see what an excellent job we did as well. So I guess this doesn't deter me. It just makes me think about, ways we can do even better to make sure that folks understand how elections are run here.
So in the past, you said you have no intention of resigning despite that call by some Republican state lawmakers. Is that still your position?
Yeah, I have a really important job to do, and that job is to always remain nonpartisan. I'm the administrator for a bipartisan commission that's appointed by legislative leadership, and I'm required by law to be nonpartisan. That's a hard job, especially in this climate right now, but it's a job that I think is so important, and I think it's more important now than ever to have somebody in this role that truly is nonpartisan, is truly in this role to carry out the directives of the legislature and of that bipartisan commission. So I really feel that right now, this job is even more important than ever, and it really needs somebody like me that is truly committed to being nonpartisan in this role.
Well, would you be concerned if you were to step down about what the future would hold for the commission? How would that work? Does that enter into your decision-making process?
It does enter into my decision-making process. I think that it would be difficult to find somebody else for this role. There's also a provision in law that if the commission can't appoint a new administrator in 45 days, then the state Senate gets to decide who that person is. And so it worries me that there's opportunities to insert somebody that might have partisan motivations into this position in the future. And I will not be swayed by one side of the aisle sort of pushing me to do something that they'd prefer. I won't be swayed by that. And so I think it's really important to have somebody that's truly nonpartisan in this role.
So let me give you a chance here to expand on what you have said already today. And that is that you're proud of the work that your team did, that the clerks of the state of Wisconsin did. If you had to characterize the performance of your agency during the 2020 election cycle, how would you describe it?
I would describe it as incredibly hard work, first of all, and work that almost felt impossible at times. When I think about my job and all the difficulties that we ran into at the state level. And I also want to point out too, I'm also proud of the commission itself. I think when they had to make tough decisions, they made some really tough decisions, and we all worked together to get through a very difficult year. And so I think it was really hard work, sometimes impossible work, but I will never underestimate the dedication and the hard work of Wisconsin's local election officials. They just did incredible things. They moved mountains. And so I'm inspired by them every day. And I really view it as my job and the job of the State Elections Commission to support their efforts.
How much, when you look back on it, obviously it changed things a great deal for everyone in all walks of life. But COVID, what did that ultimately do to your agency in terms of its decision-making, its thought process? How did it affect you?
It affected so many things when it came to election administration, just sort of those granular mechanics about elections. If you look back at the guidance that we put out in 2020, we put out hundreds of documents and memos just to work through each step of the election process. So think about something like showing a photo ID at the polls on election day and how that typically works. A voter would walk up to a poll worker, they would hand them their photo ID, they would look at it, they would compare the picture and the other qualifying information. We had to rethink all of those things in order to incorporate public health best practices in every single step of the election process while still meeting the letter of the law. And so it really, it changed how we had to think about some of those things, but at the end of the day, we still had to meet the letter of the law, and we were still able to do that. But every little thing had to be rethought, especially while we were figuring out how to navigate a world with COVID, along with the rest of the world last year. In the middle of an active election is really when this came, this came to Wisconsin, was in the middle of an active election in April of 2020. And so a lot of these things had to be figured out very quickly. And we were really grateful for the partnership of our public health officials and others who helped us think through those processes to ensure that everyone was able to vote safely.
You mentioned following the letter of the law, and I guess maybe this is a good point to bring this up. We'll walk through a couple of the criticisms that state Republicans have leveled against the agency. One of them is that they believe that laws were not followed during the election process. What do you say to that claim that sometimes the guidance that you gave was in direct conflict with state statutes?
I don't think that's true. And I think if you further analyzed it or even looked at the litigation that occurred over the last year, you'll see that the commission had to step in and really show leadership in a lot of ways in places where there were gray areas in the law and in places that just simply didn't address what to do in a global pandemic where the law was silent. And so I think in a lot of instances, the commission had to figure out how do we work within the parameters of the law, and they had to lead. They had to lead the local election officials through something that was just completely unprecedented and where our laws just aren't written to be able to cover some of those scenarios. So I think with some of the guidance that the commission issued last year, that there's also been, again, just a real misunderstanding of what it is that the commission actually did. and how those decisions were made. One of the unique things about our agency is every decision is made in a public meeting. There aren't many other agencies like that where you can actually watch the sausage being made. It's not always the best process to watch, but you can watch every decision as it's actually being made by the commission. And so I think with some of the decisions, you'll see that they did adhere to the law, certainly. It's just that some of the aspects of it looked a little different because of the conditions of the pandemic.
Well, let's use an example, one that has gotten a lot of attention, and that's what happened in Racine County, where typically you would have elections deputies go into a nursing home, for example, a couple of occasions before absentee ballots are sent to residents. In that case, that was essentially waived because you could not allow people into the nursing home because of COVID, because of health conditions. When you look back at that case, which has gotten a lot of attention and even people calling for charges to be brought against commissioners, when you look back on it, is there anything that could have been done differently? Did you do it right? How do you feel about that as you look at it today?
Well, one of the first things is, I don't have a vote on the commission. So my job is just to implement their directive. And so those decisions were bipartisan decisions that were made very deliberately, very carefully by the commission. And I think in that particular instance, they really showed leadership, because what they did is they said there's two pieces to that law. The first piece says that you have to attempt to send special voting deputies to care facilities. But if you can't meet with the residents, the second piece says that you have to send the ballots to those residents. So what they did is ensure that clerks weren't going to keep trying to get into those facilities when they knew they weren't going to be able to access them, and got those voters their ballots in time so that they could receive their ballot, they could vote their ballot, and they could return it in time to be counted. And if they hadn't taken those actions, those voters in those care facilities would not have had the same opportunity to receive and return a ballot in time like the rest of us.
So the other question that you hear from Republicans is whether or not there was fraud that we simply don't know about. And we have had, canvasses, we've had recounts, we've had audits, and no significant fraud has been discovered. And yet, within a certain portion of the population, a fair amount of Republicans, probably a majority of Republicans, do have questions about the election outcome. What do you say to those people who still have questions about whether fraud existed or happened during the 2020 election cycle?
I would really encourage people to go back and take a look at exactly how, again, elections are run, and not to sound like a broken record, but elections, there are no locked doors. There are no dark corners in elections. You can watch on election day. You can watch absentee ballots being counted in person when voters come and do in-person voting. You can even watch the absentee ballots or the regular ballots being counted on election night. And then after the election, you can even watch as the canvasses are conducted. So there's a canvas that essentially double checks the tally at the municipal level, at the county level, and at the state level. And those are all things that you can watch as they're done as well. And then we even have post-election voting equipment audits, where jurisdictions are randomly selected to have the paper ballot total compared against the machine total. And if there's ever any discrepancy there, then that would be a really big deal and something that we'd have to further pursue. But you can watch that happen as well. And so I would really encourage people to engage in those processes, engage with the mechanics and the facts about elections. And if you have questions, we have more opportunities here in Wisconsin than any other state to get involved in the election process. We have the most decentralized election system in the country. So your clerk in your town, your village, your city, they're the one that is running elections. They are your election official. They're the ones appointing the poll workers. And so talk to them, learn about how elections are run in your town, in your village, in your city. And I think you'll see that these are your neighbors, your friends, your family that are running elections in your community, and that they are really taking their job seriously, and they really conduct it with an incredible amount of integrity. And anytime there's a question, you can always go back and ask those questions about how those canvasses were conducted, how we know that the vote total is accurate.
One of the audits that was conducted was by the Legislative Audit Bureau and released not too long ago, and largely found that the election was safe and secure. The November 2020 election was safe and secure. It did have recommendations, though, for your agency, about 30 of them, I believe, It said the changes that could be made. Earlier in this interview, you said that you thought, you're always looking for ways to do things better. Does the Legislative Audit Bureau give you a new way of looking at some of these issues? What did you think when you have a chance now to reflect on it? What did you think of the Legislative Audit Bureau's audit and their suggestions?
Well, this is a really timely discussion because actually just this Wednesday,
Right.
the commission met for, I think it was about 11 hours in open session, and they went through every single one of those recommendations in the LAB report. And they really carefully considered every single one. In the majority of the 30 recommendations, they were able to come to unanimous consensus about what next steps were. Now, in some instances, we said, that's a great suggestion. That is something that we can implement quite easily. It's not something we had thought about. We will do that. In other instances, they were things that were already underway that the commission was able to solidify the direction that we were taking. And in other instances, they were able to say, this is something that we've already done, or this might represent some type of a misunderstanding. They also started the administrative rule drafting process on a number of the recommendations as well. And so we'll continue to have those conversations with the commission, present those drafts to them as they continue to pursue implementing those recommendations. So I was really pleased that the commission was able to get through all 30, because that was a heavy lift to make sure that everybody was prepared for that meeting and that everybody was able to take a really careful consideration of each of those recommendations and give us really clear direction about what to implement moving forward.
So let's talk for a couple of moments about several of the recommendations that you're considering or that work may already be underway. So let's begin with talking about drop boxes. Where do we stand on drop boxes? How will that process play out as we begin to get a better handle on how they might be used or if they will be used in the future?
Right. So the recommendation by the LAB was that the commission should consider pursuing an administrative rule regarding drop boxes. And so that's what the commission is doing. So the commission asked us to come back with a draft that lays out what would guidance look like for municipalities on how to implement drop boxes. So what should they consider when it comes to security, when it comes to voter accessibility? And so they'll review that draft and decide if there's anything else they want to add into that draft. And then we'll start the administrative rule process on that. But I think administrative rules are complicated. There's 31 steps in the process where there's a lot of voices that get a chance to weigh in or make changes or reject the rule. So that's just the first of 31 steps, but that's the step that we're undertaking now. And we'll hopefully provide additional clarity on how to make sure that any drop boxes utilized by municipalities are secure and accessible to the voters that use them.
Could these adjustments or clarifications be made in time for the 2022 elections?
The administrative rule process, from what I understand, typically takes about 14 months, but that doesn't mean that we can't start that process now and continue to give best practices in the meantime to our clerks about how to do those things securely. There is also litigation on some of these matters like drop boxes. So of course, if a court does give us additional direction on that, then we'll work with all of our local officials to implement the court's directive as well.
Bring us up to date on possible adjustments for the issue of what information clerks can provide on an absentee ballot envelope. If there's missing information, how much they can provide there. Help us better understand where we are in this moment.
Well, thanks for, first of all, phrasing that question the way you did, because a lot of times we hear from people that they think this is clerks correcting ballots, and nothing could be further from the truth. This is the absentee certificate envelope. So if you've ever voted by absentee, you know that you have to certify on your certificate envelope that you're the voter who cast it. And then you have to have a witness that witnessed you filling out that ballot. And that witness has to sign the ballot. That signature always has to be there from the voter and the witness. And then the witness is also asked to provide their address. The law doesn't specify what components of an address have to be part of that witness section. And so what clerks can do is if they receive an absentee certificate envelope, and let's say it's missing the zip code, but they know that it's in that jurisdiction. Let's say it's missing the city, but that street and that house number is within that city. They're able to add that missing address information and then initial it. That was a decision that was made by our commission in 2016. So it's been in place for 2 presidential elections. And what the commission did and what the LAB recommended is that we take that guidance and that, again, we solidify it in the form of an administrative rule. And so that's what the commission also directed, is that we take a look at that existing guidance that's been in place since 2016, and we start drafting a rule. They also asked staff to come up with an alternative for their consideration to the guidance that's currently in place. So that's what you'll see us bringing them at the next meeting, is a rule that looks like the current guidance and then an alternative to that rule.
What about the training of clerks? What's being done? That was something that came up in the audit. What needs to be done? What are you doing?
So I believe there were 5 recommendations that pertain to training. And in all those instances, I was so pleased to see that the LAB recognized that our training is really good in terms of our local election officials. I think one of the things that we all struggle with is we have 1,850 clerks. So again, every city, town, and village has an election official. And the turnover, last it was reported to us, is somewhere around 1/3 of those clerks every year. So we're talking about a new clerk in the system every week in some instances. And so keeping them trained requires that we're always looking at our training to ensure that it resonates with our local election officials and to ensure that it's accessible to them on their time. Because a lot of our local election officials, 2/3 of them, are part-time clerks. And so that means they have another full-time job, and they might be a clerk for a few hours for their municipality. So they need to be able to do their training on their own time. And so the LAB gave us some suggestions about places we could augment our training. In one instance, they asked us to work with vendors of voting equipment to encourage them to provide training on paper ballot jams at the polling place. But we'll certainly implement those recommendations and got direction to do so from the commission so that we can augment those other 5 areas of our existing training to make sure that we're focusing on those places that were identified in the audit as places that the clerks might benefit from additional training.
So bottom line, you feel that that you are listening to what was reported in the audit, that you're trying to address concerns raised in the audit. Would that be correct to say that you are responding in an affirmative way to what the audit has suggested?
Yeah, I believe that is the case. Later today, we're going to be sending a letter to the Joint Legislative Committee on Audits describing the action that the commission took on each of the LAB's recommendations. I think the next steps are we still are working with LAB and hoping for some more direction on how to correct the record on a couple of items. But I think for right now, we really want to focus on the positive work that the commission did of taking a very serious, deliberate look at the report, taking heart to some of the recommendations that were made and implementing those. And now next, the commission will be looking towards, for direction about how do we get to correct some of the items that weren't quite right because we weren't given a chance to review the report like other agencies.
Some of the members of the bipartisan commission were quite critical of the audit. You said you'd like a chance to correct some of the things that have been said. Give us an example, something that's really important to commission members and to you that you feel needs to be corrected.
I think there's 2 things that strike me as things that we know need to be corrected, and I did say this in my testimony to the committee as well. The first is how they describe our use of ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center. And I'm actually very proud that I serve as the chair of the ERIC system right now. And it's a consortium of states that shares data so that we're able to keep our voter lists maintained. And we're also able to alert voters who may be eligible to register to vote that they have that opportunity. And so how the report classifies our usage of ERIC makes it seem like we didn't accept reports as often as we could have or didn't fully utilize those reports. And really nothing could be further from the truth. The commission has taken steps pretty much yearly to very carefully figure out how to implement all of the ERIC data in accordance with state law and in accordance with federal law too in some instances. And so there was a chart, for instance, in the report that made it look like there were opportunities to accept data when we didn't even have the opportunity to accept that data. For instance, there's something called a voter participation report that tries to identify voters who may have voted in Wisconsin and another state. That's a new report to ERIC and was only first available to us in 2019. And how it's presented makes it look like we have had other opportunities to take that data, which we didn't.
Mm-hmm. Let me follow up on this because, it seems like what we've talked about in the last 5 minutes, the potential changes and the things you're doing to address some of these concerns are not resonating with Republican lawmakers. And I'll quote Steve Noss, who is the co-chair of the Joint Committee for Administrative Rules. He said, Wednesday's meeting that we've discussed left little doubt that you and the commissioners, and I'm going to quote him now directly, he said that you and the commissioners are, quote, simply not interested or capable of coming into compliance with the findings of the LAB audit and provisions of state law. He went on to say, the lack of knowledge regarding state law, in particular by the administrator, is either an intentional omission or pure incompetence. What's your response to that?
Well, I do not engage in partisan bickering. And I think that's really a baseless claim. There aren't any actual examples that are provided in there. And so I think the commission did do a lot to address all the recommendations. They had an 11-hour meeting. I mean, that's proof that they deliberately and carefully went through every single recommendation. And we also have a statute that says we now have to post the video of that meeting and our minutes to the website today. So anybody can go and see the actual action that the commission took on all of those recommendations. And I think you'll find it very encouraging to look at the commission's recommendations because, again, remember, every time they make a unanimous decision, that's a bipartisan decision. That means that 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats agreed on the path forward. And so I think it's a really powerful statement that the 6 commissioners were able to come together to find a path forward on so many of these recommendations.
I think I'm asking that question because maybe it's a larger point, and that is, where is this all headed ultimately? And there have been a couple of developments in the last 2 weeks or so that make you ask that question. In an interview with the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, Senator Ron Johnson, the U.S. Senator from the state of Wisconsin, said he thought the WEC had been systematically violating state laws, and he told Republican lawmakers, urged them to reassert their authority over federal elections, elections for president, elections for Congress, and to simply tell clerks around the state to ignore the advice of the Wisconsin Elections Commission, that it is null and void. What is your reaction to that?
Well, I think fortunately we haven't seen a lot of traction on that. And we've also, it seems like, seen people that would have the power to make that decision sort of distancing themselves from that decision. But I also am encouraged whenever I hear sort of these, partisan grandstanding sort of statements made. I'm encouraged by the fact that we have 1,850 local election officials and that they know the law and they are implementing the law in their communities. So sometimes, even if we put out guidance that they might not agree with, or leaves gray area is probably the more likely scenario, they work with their own counsel and they decide how to implement the law. And so I think even if we did see some attempts to have conflicting guidance that's issued to clerks, at the end of the day, these are incredible, dedicated public servants that are running elections in each of our communities, and they're going to continue to follow the law. They're going to continue to serve their communities, and I think despite everything else that goes on, that's going to keep happening, and we're going to keep running great elections here in the state of Wisconsin.
So the other thing that's happening concurrently is you have the investigation by former Justice Michael Gableman, and this week he said that. He felt that the mayor of Madison, the mayor of Green Bay, and you had engaged in cover-ups, and we're not cooperating with his investigation. Now he's threatened to jail the mayor of Green Bay and the mayor of Madison. I don't think he's threatened to jail you yet, but the question I have is, Have you cooperated fully? Should you be cooperating fully with this investigation?
So, one of the things that we did is we provided all of the documents that were requested of us. Thousands and thousands of documents were provided. All of the public records requests that we issued to others throughout 2020, those were all provided. And so I think really the questions that still linger is the form and formats of any sort of interviews that would happen. I willingly appeared before the Assembly Committee on Elections and provided testimony about the grant funding in local communities. That's available on Wisconsin Eye, my full testimony. And that is everything that there is in terms of involvement at the state level, which is to say that, this was a local decision. It was a local decision made in local communities. And that's certainly something for them to discuss how they see legally appropriate. But in terms of the state's involvement in it, we have cooperated fully, and we have said everything that we have to say on the matter.
So I was reminded of a conversation that we had more than a year ago. I think it was in September of 2020, and it was you, and it was the elections commissioner from the city of Milwaukee, and the clerk from the city of Brookfield, and the three of us were talking about the upcoming election. And one of the things that came up consistently during that conversation was transparency, and you were encouraging people to take a closer look at the work that goes into elections, to have a better understanding of elections, to have a better understanding of how votes are counted. And here we are at this moment. And so my question is, how is what's happening now being received by the clerks all around the state who have been trying to run these elections, especially during a very challenging period in our nation's history?
Yeah, and I think our clerks and our office, we all have a deep commitment to transparency. And I think that is what you're seeing play out here, is that we have every meeting in public. We're used to every email that we send to being public. I mean, we're used to operating in the public sphere, of having full transparency on what we do. And I think for the clerks, it even runs a little deeper than that. The clerks are by law the custodians of the official artifacts of the election. So they're the ones by law that are responsible for making sure that there's no tampering with, no destruction of their ballots, of their poll books, of their absentee envelopes, of all those official materials of the election. And so in some communities, they've had to juggle some really interesting and difficult questions in terms of balancing that, securing those official artifacts of the election and being the custodians charged with that, with transparency. And so I think clerks are always willing to talk about how elections are run, to provide records and information. But then they also have to consider, how do we ensure that we're not compromising the official artifacts of the election? If somebody were to gain access to a ballot or ballots in a community, and something were to happen to those because the clerk didn't take enough careful, appropriate measure to make sure that they were safeguarded, those can't be replaced, right? And so I think it's a really important job they have as custodians of that information, and they're always trying to balance that security with transparency.
I guess the fundamental question here is, how do we restore confidence in our elections and our election process, given what we've seen? Certainly Republicans have been vocal in their concerns. Democrats are concerned that future elections might be altered depending on which party is in power. There is this, I think, doubt that surrounds elections right now. How do we restore it? Confidence?
I think that is a great question, Mike. And it's a question that keeps me up at night too, because I think, I don't know that there's an easy answer to it. I have a couple of thoughts, but I don't think that they're full solutions to the problem. The first is, again, just making sure people know where they can watch elections as they happen, where they can engage with the process. I think that's really important, and I think it's really powerful. A lot of times when people have questions about something that happened at a polling place or happened at a central count location, when they know somebody from their own party or somebody they trust was there, observed it, and is able to vouch that it went how it was supposed to, that's really a powerful message to that person that, okay, I can trust what happened there because somebody I trust was actually there firsthand to witness it. And so I think we need to continue to figure out how can we create meaningful engagement in elections so that people can watch elections as they happen in a way that provides context, trust, in that process as well. And so I think things like the observer programs and other things that are a core part of elections, how can we make those things even better so that they can take what they saw at the polls or during the canvass and share that with people who need that information about how the election was run. The other thing I think we need to do, because a word that I hear a lot from people is they're also concerned about consistency in elections. And I think that's one of the downsides with such a decentralized system is we've got really small towns and really large cities all running elections, and they might look different in different communities. And so how can we make that process more consistent throughout the state? And, the answer to that is a simple one, but a historically difficult one. And that is we need to fund and support local election offices. We had a grant program before 2020 where we offered $1,200 to local election officials to ensure that they had computers, ensure that they had access to training and IT support. We had over 1,000 clerks apply for that grant because they were not provided those things by their communities. And so I think if we want to see elections augmented in some communities, if we want to make sure that they're run consistently or resourced consistently around the state, then we need to fund them consistently. We need to make sure that our local election officials have opportunities to attend training. They have opportunities to provide things like drop boxes or more hours for in-person voting to their communities. And that all starts with funding. And so I really think it's an investment question. Do we want to invest in having consistency across the state in our elections?
Should there be consistency in other election practices, hours that the polls are open, when the votes must be tabulated by, how many drop boxes per X number of people? Do we need more consistency on those terms?
I think that on election day, you see a lot of consistency, right? We have to have the polls open during a consistent time. Those practices are all the same. I think where you see some inconsistencies, and I think this is because of funding, is in things prior to the election. So like you said, things like drop boxes, in-person absentee hours. If you're a small town clerk and you're paid to do your job for 5 hours a week, and you're not given a town hall, so you have to do absentee voting out of your home. And for about 1,200 of our clerks, that is their scenario. So if that's what you're handed, of course, you're not going to have as many hours for in-person registration or in-person absentee voting as other communities who have a full-time election staff. And so I really think that this is a community question, and that if people want to see those services in their community, then that's something they need to invest in their communities.
Before I take an audience question or two, one other point, and this is kind of a more challenging question, and I don't even know if you can weigh on this in a meaningful way here. It may not be fair, but one of the concerns you can see amongst Republicans is the role that outside consultants or outside money coming in and saying, we can help administer an election, we can help your community do this. And that certainly happened. A Mark Zuckerberg related group helped 5 cities where there are large Democratic voter populations. They helped cities all around the state, we should say, for the record. And some of them were Republicans or the people who have more power than Democrats. But does more guidance need to be given to those municipalities and how they handle that to prevent the appearance that somebody outside of the election system is having undue influence?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question too, and certainly at the heart of a lot of questions that we hear. First of all, those are municipal decisions, right? And so I think, again, a lot of these things boil down to the communities and what's their decision-making process in those communities. And voters having an opportunity to weigh in at that juncture. The other is if the legislature or others would like to see something different, then that's an instance where a law would have to be passed. The current law is completely moot on anything to do with grant funding or things like consultants in elections. That's not something that's prescribed. And so those are municipal decisions. And I guess I would say that if that's something where there's a desire to see it done differently, then a law would need to be passed specifying what that should look like. And then we would certainly follow that law.
So that's a decision or decisions that need to be made by municipalities and decisions that need to be made by state lawmakers before that gets to you. Gotcha. Let me ask Hillary DeBlois, who is our program manager here at the Lubar Center, if there are any questions that we've had from audience members that she can pass along to you. Hillary?
Thank you, Mike. I do have two questions. The first one, Meagan, you spoke about the changeover of election clerks. It also takes many volunteers to make Election Day happen. Has training for Election Day volunteers changed or been strengthened in light of the concerns about the most recent election?
That's a great question. And so training of poll workers under state law is a responsibility of each municipal clerk. So in some communities, again, they have more time, resources to invest in that, so they might have a more robust program. In other communities, they don't. One of the things that we did that I think is a really positive change in 2020 is because there were so many new poll workers. You know, we had such a shortage, especially early on in 2020, that we actually were lucky enough to have the National Guard help us in some communities where they couldn't find enough poll workers. And there was just an infusion of new poll workers throughout the year. So what we did is we developed some online training modules that any community can use to train their poll workers. And we encourage clerks to utilize that. If they don't have the time or resources to develop their own, they can utilize what we put together. And I think it's been really effective. It's not something that's our role statutorily, but it's the right thing to do. And I think that was sort of the motto last year, is there were a lot of things like that that maybe weren't, we weren't going to get credit for, but it was certainly the right thing to do. And I'm so thankful so many people stepped up to be poll workers last year because there was so much uncertainty and communities were really struggling to find enough poll workers. And, it still kind of gives me goosebumps to this day that last April, we were able to find enough poll workers so that all of the municipalities in the state were able to open a polling location in all 1,850 municipalities. And that's pretty incredible.
Thank you. One more question. What about the ramifications of a willful refusal to accept the facts of how the WEC works? I say this a lot, and sometimes I sound like a broken record, I'm sure, but I really think that people have an obligation to engage in the facts. I'm always thinking about what are better ways we can make elections more engaging. We can create opportunities for people to learn about elections. How can we make sure that people have this critical information? But at the end of the day, despite what work we do to make sure that that information is available, people have an obligation to engage with those facts. And I think sometimes folks don't necessarily want to because it challenges other thoughts or beliefs that they might have. But I really think at the end of the day, people have an obligation to engage with the facts about elections before they start, stating things about elections as fact. They should really take the time to understand how they work. And again, here in Wisconsin, we have more opportunities to learn from the actual election officials than any other state. So in your city, your town, your village, you have a clerk. They're the best source of that information to help you understand how elections are run. And you can even go watch. And I encourage people that are skeptical of the process, that don't trust the process, to get involved. We have opportunities coming up here in the spring, in both February and April. We're going to have opportunities to have elections in every single community. Get involved, get engaged, and actually learn about how elections work. Thank you very much. Mike, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, I'll end. Thanks, Hillary, and I'll end with just a final question for Meagan Wolfe. So your agency was created to replace the Government Accountability Board, which state lawmakers grew frustrated with and got rid of. And now there is unhappiness with the current format. So my question is, you talk to people all over the country, you're familiar with how people administer elections. Is there a better way of doing this than the one we have in Wisconsin? Or how do we stack up compared to other states in terms of our efficiency and our credibility?
There's different ways to run it. I guess I won't establish any sort of value or ascribe any sort of value to the different ways to run elections, but there certainly are different ways. 40 states are overseen by a Secretary of State. The other 10 in some of the territories have structures more like ours. There's some that are sort of a combination of the two. So there are all sorts of structures. But one of the things I think is underappreciated about our structure is, again, that every decision is made in public, every single decision. The commission had almost 40 meetings last year where they made all of those decisions. And those are chances for the public to weigh in during public comment. It's an opportunity for somebody to object to the decision that's being made. And so I think if there was a different model considered, that's something that we would potentially lose. In a lot of other states or agencies, decisions about elections are made unilaterally by a single individual making those decisions. In this case, you've got to get 6 hyper-partisan sort of individuals appointed by legislative leadership to agree, at least 4 of them to agree in order to implement something. And I think that the commission functions as it's designed in law. So I guess all I can really say is that, if there's a desire to see a different structure in place, it would require a law change. And, I certainly would respect any change in that law, but I think there's always a give and take in terms of what a different structure could bring or take away from the transparency of the process.
Meagan Wolfe is the administrator of the Wisconsin Elections Commission. Always appreciate you spending time with us and our audience today. And we should mention to people who are watching, if you'd like to go back and take another look at this, we will be posting it on YouTube later today. Meagan Wolfe, thanks very much, and happy holidays to you. We appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. You as well.